Hello and welcome. It's the small bus with the big following. In fact, it's won a Queen's Award for Enterprise and a Millennium Product Award. And if you look very closely at the back end of each of these buses, you'll see it says Millennium Product Award on the side of it. Oh, and it could be regarded as one of the first low-floor minibuses in production. So what bus are we looking at? In this video, we are looking at the Optare Solo. Now, I know I seem to say this an awful lot on this channel, but Solos are very much Marmite buses, aren't they? You either love them or you hate them. They seem to get quite a lot of flack from not only drivers, but also bus enthusiasts as well. But they were built to do a job, and that job was to be a low-floor, small, midi and minibus. In a previous video, we looked at the evolution of the minibus, and that ended up with the story of the Optare Metrorider. Well, in all fairness, the MCW and the Optare Metrorider, as MCW started it and Optare finished it. Now, when we looked at the Optare Metrorider, we found out that the minibus design had evolved from van-based vehicles, and that normally meant that the chassis was quite high. The Metrorider, being a purpose-built bus, allowed the floor to be a little bit lower. Now, the low-floor revolution hadn't at that point taken off, and low floors were there to help and aid people get on the bus, but not in the same way as they are now. As well as the accessibility things, being a slightly lowered floor meant that the standing passengers could still see out of the window and didn't have to stoop, and it made the bus more airy and more passenger-friendly inside. By the 1990s, there was a new phrase in the bus industry, and this spread to enthusiasts as well. And this was based on the Disabled Persons Transport Advisory Committee. This became shortened to DIPTAC. So what is DIPTAC, and who are the Disabled Persons Transport Advisory Committee? It's one of those things and one of those names that we all tend to know, but we don't really understand what they do. Well, as they say in their name, they are an advisory committee, and they advise the UK government and other bodies on the accessibility policy and practices on transport for disabled people. Now, as I said earlier, step-free and low-entrance buses aren't really anything new. You can go back to the early Leyland Atlanteans, the early Daimler Fleet Lines, or indeed the Bristol Low-Decker, and you just step up from the road and it's a flat floor all the way through. In fact, making buses accessible to less able people was something that's been on the bus industry's mind for decades. And we're going to go right back to the Great War era. Although, to be fair, there is certainly nothing great about it. Now, this really was an absolute horrendous time, and it would see hundreds of thousands of men injured, and of course many more hundreds of thousands of men killed. In that post-World War I era, there was obviously a lot of people who couldn't move around in the same way that they had done prior to the war. You had people who were amputees, and there were a greater number of wheelchair users as well. Now, at the time, a little bit like our 1970s and 1980s minibuses, passenger-carrying vehicles tended to be adapted from chassis that were also used for carriage of goods. And this meant that there were quite a few steps to get into the saloon of the buses. Now, with the large increase in the disabled population caused by the ex-servicemen, it was noted that these high floors and high steps weren't particularly helpful. And whilst there was no corporate body or official recommendations, bus design very slowly evolved. And this would see buses fitted with handrails and stanchions, which would allow passengers to haul themselves up and find a seat. Whereas before things were just fitted and hoped for the best, more attention was paid to the design of steps and entrances. And bus manufacturers started moving away from using goods chassis for passenger chassis as well. However, it would take a good 10 years before the likes of the AEC Regent, the AEC Regal, and the Leyland Titan TD1 would come along, which were all purpose-built bus chassis with slightly lower saloon floors. Now, when you think of accessibility issues, automatically you do tend to think of people with physical disabilities, but that's not always the case. It can be people who are recovering from surgery, people who are recovering from an accident, or it can be such a thing as somebody with a pram or a buggy, or even people carrying heavy shopping bags or luggage. Unfortunately though, when people wanted to travel by bus in a wheelchair, it normally meant that they had to travel on some community-based bus scheme or a taxi bus, or even some special service that had a converted single-decker bus. There were quite a few of these around at one point. These could be things like Bristol REs or Leyland Nationals with a wheelchair lift on the side that would allow the loading of the wheelchair, and it could be a little bit precarious, to be fair. They certainly weren't mainstream bus routes, and the people tended to have to go where the bus was going rather than where they wanted to go. Remember too, this is the time when people in wheelchairs also had to travel in the guards vans on trains. With the advent of vehicles with air suspension, such as the Leyland National, came the opportunity to have something called a kneeling bus. This basically would take the air out of the front air suspension and allow the bus to drop down at the front, something that today's low-floor buses actually still do. South Yorkshire were a big pioneer of this with their fleet of Leyland Nationals, and they painted the bumpers on these kneeling Nationals red so that people could tell when it had the kneeling facility. This decreases the distance between the pavement and the front step of the bus, but anyone who's ever travelled on a Leyland National will know that once you get on the first step, there's an equally beefy step to get onto to take you into the saloon floor. And it certainly wasn't wheelchair accessible or even buggy accessible. In those days, buggies had to be folded up and put in the luggage bin. But when it came to accessibility, it was certainly a step in the right direction, and it was a step to admitting that buses needed to be more accessible. In the 1980s, things started to step up a little bit, no pun intended there of course, and this would see the formation of the Disabled Persons Transport Advisory Committee, we mentioned them earlier, DIPTAC, who came about under the Transport Act of 1985. 1985 would see the first low-floor bus specification being drafted out by DIPTAC. However, at that point, not an awful lot happened. 10 years later, the Disability Discrimination Act of 1995 would specify that all new public service vehicles which were over 22 seats should be low floor from the 31st of December 2000, and this would be followed with smaller vehicles being mandated from the 1st of January 2005. Now, interestingly, before this, Dennis had launched the super low floor Dennis Lance, the SLF. This being released in March 1993, and this was the first low floor bus chassis manufactured in the United Kingdom. This bus featured a step-free entrance, and a wheelchair ramp was also provided as standard, and the bus also featured kneeling suspension. Dennis Lances with Wright Pathfinder low-floor bodywork started to enter service with all sorts of operators, including London buses. And if you'd like a video on these pioneer low-floor buses, the Dennis Lances, as well as the Scanias that followed them, you know what to do, just comment down below. In 1996, Dennis launched a low-floor version of the Dart, which was known as the Dart SLF. And this really is where the low-floor buses took off. Now, I have done a video about the Dennis Dart low-floor bus, the SLF, so I will try and remember to link that in at the top right-hand corner, so you can go and watch that at your leisure. So, apologies for that rather lengthy introduction. But I thought it would be quite interesting to go back to the history of the low-floor vehicle and where it all really started. And it doesn't really start where you think it does it? It starts way back in the 1920s, maybe a few years before that. The current generation of low-floor vehicles is probably what was needed with all the wounded servicemen coming back from the front in the First World War. But all they got was London General B-types. So at this point there was single-decker buses being produced as low-floor vehicles and double-decker low-floor vehicles as well. But this left a bit of a gap in the market. Well, in fact, two gaps in the market. One, of course, being minibuses and the other being coaches. Well, we're going to talk about minibuses today rather than coaches. That's something else we'll leave for a rainy day, I think. At the time, there was no minibus or midi bus that was low floor. And without a doubt, Optare spotted that gap in the market. The Solo would be an integral design, and it was built to a modular construction. It was built out of steel box section framework and fiberglass panels. Now, initially, it was offered with just the Mercedes-Benz OM904LA engine, which can produce either 122 brake horsepower or 147 brake horsepower, depending on how it's tweaked. And this would typically be mated to an Allison fully automatic gearbox. The engine would be mounted at the rear of the bus and would be in line with the chassis, in a very similar layout to the Dennis Dart. And herein lies a controversy, because the engine being at the rear, a lot of people, myself included in some respects, tends to think that because the engine's at the back, it's not necessarily a true minibus. Now, as I said in the video of the Optare Metrorider, it doesn't mean that the Solo's a bad bus, it just means it's a different bus. And the Solo has carved itself a niche market with its size and its layout. And yes, there are now more Mercedes-Benz Sprinter low-floor buses around than there's ever been, with even the big groups like Arriva and Stagecoach taking examples. And I think these low-floor Mercedes actually qualify more for the badge of being a minibus rather than the Solo, as they have the engine at the front, as traditional minibuses tend to do. The Solo, well, that's just really a Solo, isn't it? An individual design. Anyway, Jake, stick with the programme, stop getting distracted. Later, engine options would include the Cummins ISB 6-cylinder or an MAN engine. A 4-speed Allison fully automatic gearbox would also become an option too. Now, the chassis code of the Solo corresponds to the length of the bus, and of the first 3 that were built, the first 2 were 9.2 metre variants, the third one being an 8.5 metre variant. The Solo would be available eventually in several lengths: 7.8 metres, 8.5 metres, 9.2 metres and 9.9 metres. Now, interestingly, the Cummins-powered Solos required a little bit of extra length in the rear bodywork to accommodate this larger engine, and this would increase the overall length on the Cummins vehicles by 1 foot. Initially, the Solo was offered in a width of 2.5 metres, which translates into 8 foot 2.5 inches in old money. However, later on in 2004, there would be a slimline model launched, which would be 2.33 metres wide or 7 foot 8 inches wide in old money. Incidentally, the slimline models would have an SL suffix to the chassis code. The first one built, which was VN6001, was a test rig for Optare, so they could see what they were doing. The second bus, VN6002, these of course being the chassis numbers, was finished as S903 DUB. The third one was VN6003, and this was the 8.5 metre version, and this became S794 XUG. Both the registered versions were initially demonstrators for Optare, although these would later be sold to bus companies, with S903 DUB ending up with MK Metro and then being moved on to Arriva, whilst S794 XUG would end up with Southwest Coaches. Production would kick off with the 8.5 metre variant, starting from chassis number VN6004, and these would be for Wilts and Dorset, being delivered from May 1998, these buses being 30-seaters. Other early customers for the Solo would include Garnet, Go Weir buses, Quickstep. Wow, that's a blast from the past. I'd forgotten all about Quickstep travel. They operated in Leeds and had Leyland Nationals running around in a privatisation Devon General style livery. In October 1998, the first 9.2 metre buses were delivered, and these went to Nottingham, and these were 33-seaters, the first one being S282NRB. The customer database continued to grow, with companies such as Travel London, Reading, MK Metro, West Midlands, PMT, Blackpool and Ulsterbus, to name a few. Now, another little factoid I'm going to slip in for you is when the Solo kneeled down, i.e. the air suspension dropped the front of the bus, the entrance would be a credible 200mm or 8 inches in old money from the ground. Now, I previously mentioned the Slimline model, which was launched in 2004. In 2006, Optare announced another Solo variant, and this would be the Solo SE. And despite having the engine at the rear, this is getting into proper minibus territory, because it was just 7.1 metres long, or 23 foot 4 inches in old money, and this would be the shortest Solo offered. All of the SE models would be slimline buses as well. In October 2007, Optare decided to give the Solo a bit of a makeover, and this would be the Solo SR, which was unveiled at the Coach and Bus show. The Solo SR has a much more curvaceous front end than the original Solo, with a large one-piece windscreen behind which sits the destination blind. The roof then sweeps back, leaving a little bit of a hump at the front, which can be a little bit strange when you first see it. But not only does this hump hold the destination equipment, it also hides the air conditioning equipment if it's fitted. For a while, the two types of Solo were produced. However, in January 2012, Optare announced that the facelifted Solo SR would replace the standard or original Solo for both the UK and the export markets. Now, there have been hybrid and EV versions of both types of the Solo. In fact, Optare were experimenting with a hybrid electric variant of the Solo way back in 2004. This variant would eventually be launched in 2010. A year before that, in March 2009, Optare would launch the all-electric version of the Solo, and this would be the Solo EV. Now, as I mentioned previously, Solos entered service at all sorts of companies around the country. But the Solo certainly just isn't a phenomenon in this country. It's become a bit of a global success. They have popped up in all sorts of places such as Malta, the Republic of Ireland, Sweden, the Netherlands, Hungary, Hong Kong, Israel, Dubai, Cape Town, New Zealand, Melbourne, Queensland, Hamilton Island. Now, for a while, Optare was owned by North American Bus Industries, and this would lead to the left-hand drive version of the Solo being sold in America between 2003 and 2005. Now I'm going to throw in another little factoid about the Solo. In a very similar way to those Devon General Iveco minibuses that were roaring around in the 1990s, the Solo could also be dual-doored. And I know we should be used to it by now, but it still seems strange seeing such a small bus with two sets of doors on it, doesn't it? In 2020, Optare was rebranded to Switch Mobility, which isn't overly a catchy name, is it? Switch Mobility could do all sorts of things. They could supply mobility cars. They could sell those chairs that June Whitfield tries to sell you on daytime television. It could be anything, couldn't it? It's rather ambiguous. Now, ironically, it's now a subsidiary of the Indian company Ashok Leyland. The irony is that Optare was carved from the old Charlie Road Coachworks, which way back in the 1980s was a subsidiary of British Leyland. Isn't it funny how things tend to go full circle, especially in the bus industry? Now, despite the name change, the Solo SR and the Solo SR EV are still in production. And if it stays in production until 2028, which, to be honest, there seems to be no reason why it won't, it would have been in production for 30 years. Can you believe it? 30 years of the Solo. How old do we all feel now, eh? There are already solos in preservation, and they're very worthy attendances on the rally field and at running days. And I think anybody who loves buses and is into buses has to take their hat off to these new, younger generation of bus enthusiasts who take on these newer vehicles. They're not the sort of things that you can fix and have a fiddle around with on a Sunday afternoon. They normally need laptops to get them running and all sorts of bits and bobs like that. And then, of course, there's that famous box section steel framework, which, again, tends to rust a little bit, doesn't it? And coupled to all that, these buses have to have an MOT. There's no MOT exemption because they're not historic vehicles, and they have to pay road tax on them too. Absolute dedication, it really is. And it's nice because it shows that our hobby is continuing and it's evolving at the same time. And whilst those preservation pioneers such as Prince Marshall probably wouldn't really be interested in Optare Solos, I'm sure they'd be quite pleased to see that the hobby's still continuing and still going strong. In fact, next time I see John Lyons, now John is the owner of two rather fine East Kent Guy Arabs, and he's also a pioneer bus preservationist, getting involved right back in the 1960s, before bus preservation became fashionable. I'll have to ask him next time I see him, what does he think of the Optare Solo? Well, I hope you enjoyed this look at not only the Optare Solo, but also a little bit of a delve into the whys and wherefores behind the low floor buses. Now, don't forget to share your memories and comments of the Solo down below. I love reading your comments. I'm going to start the ball rolling because way back in 2013, I came away from driving and worked behind the scenes. And this would come to a peak in 2016 when I would help run a taxi garage. However, there's a very wise saying that says don't burn your bridges or turn your back on where you've come from, and the taxi garage went a little bit peak tong. So I found myself heading back to driving buses at Regent Coaches in Whitstable on the Kent coast. And the first bus I drove in anger after those years away from driving was an Optare Solo. I genuinely love this little bus, despite it having a few temperamental spats on me and refusing to start or breaking down or suffering from water ingress or just generally being a pain in the arse. But we did have a very good working relationship most of the time. Well, I think so anyway. If you was to speak to the bus in question, I'm sure that would probably give you another answer. So there we go. There's my Solo moment. What about you? What have you had dealings with Optare Solos? Please comment, let me know down below. As I've said before, I love reading your comments. If you did enjoy this video, please like and share it, and don't forget to hype the video, because the more times you hype the video, the more it gets noticed by the algorithms at YouTube, and that's a good thing because it helps the channel grow. If you are enjoying the content on the channel, you can offer super thanks too. And I would appreciate that very much because it helps encourage me to keep going and making videos like this. It gives you the opportunity to buy me a hot chocolate, buy me a J2O, or buy me a beer. Buy me a beer when the going gets tough. Most of the time, a J2O or a hot chocolate would be perfect. Thank you very much. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, as that way you won't miss out when I make my future releases in this and my other series here on YouTube. Now, don't forget to have a look through my back catalogue. It's nothing rude, I can assure you. Just make sure your hands are warm first. There might be something there that catches your attention and appeals to you. Once again, thank you ever so much for watching. Bye for now.